Now, we spent the last hour doing our exegesis of chapters 8 to 10. And that's step one. What was going on between Paul and Corinth? I think we should just make a few final explanatory notes about that. There were some who asked what the nature of the stumbling block principle was in chapter 8, if in fact he's going to forbid it in chapter 10. And the point I would make is that Paul always begins on the basis of grace. Otherwise, he's going to turn grace into law. That is, he's going to out and out forbid it, but he doesn't start by out and out forbidding it. He starts by telling them, look, if you were really Christians, you wouldn't have done it in the first place, because to be a Christian means you wouldn't cause your brother to stumble. So think Christians. But just in case you can't hear that, he says, you also have to realize that this is absolutely forbidden in any case. And the reason it is absolutely forbidden is a theological one. It stands, and it isn't forbidden in the sense that it's law, you understand. It's not that you can't do it because God's against it, it's law. It's that God's against it because it is an absolute contradiction to your existence as a Christian. In other words, it's true, all things are lawful, but that's within the framework of a certain amount of law of non-contradiction. You cannot be a Christian and a pagan simultaneously. In other words, that's not an option for you. You see what I'm saying? So you cannot, it's contradictory to your existence to sit at the table of demons and the table of the Lord. But you remember, he starts on grace. He does the same thing with that business in 6:12 to 20. In verse 18, 19, he's going to say, therefore flee. Absolutely get away from porneia, from immorality. But he doesn't start there. He starts by saying, what's the nature of Christian freedom? What's the nature of the understanding of the body? And once you understand things theologically, you shouldn't have done it. But just in case you don't hear that, it's contradictory to you. You can't do these two things simultaneously. So on the basis of that kind of contradiction, it is absolutely forbidden. But not forbidden because it's law, you understand, but forbidden because of what it means to be Christian. A Christian is one who really wants to become one. This is not within the framework of options to you. Now, there are all kinds of things in these chapters that we could talk about in terms of moving into the 20th century. For example, there are some things in chapter 9 that are very interesting. 19 and following, where Paul says, to the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, as one under the law. To those not under the law, he says, I became as one outside the law. Not that I was without law to God, you see. Not that I was outside of the will and the framework of God's will and obedience, but as those who don't have the law, I was lived as one outside the law. And that's exactly what's going on here, you see, with regard to this food offered to idols, this in the marketplace. When he was with the Jews, did he eat that food? Well, obviously not. But when he was with the pagans, he did. And of course, they saw that conduct, and they said, well, he's just nothing but a wishy-washy old. Now, I've got a word to say to you in the 20th century about this. If you really live out what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9, 19 to 23, you are destined for misunderstanding. There is not a possible way you can live. In other words, the easiest out is to just be consistent and only do one thing. And then only one side is ever going to, be uptight about you. But if you live one way with one group and another way with another group about things that are adiaphora, you are destined for misunderstanding. But for Paul, that doesn't matter. You understand? For Paul, that doesn't matter. It isn't how do we understand me, or am I going to, people loving me. The only question is that I might win the more. And you see, the point is that Paul has really come to grips with the fact that this is adiaphora. Food offered in the marketplace, things that have to do with this law. It is adiaphora. It doesn't matter to God. And what doesn't matter to God? Now, obviously, eating in the temple matters to God. We're not talking about that. But, other things, food in the marketplace, that doesn't matter to God. Now, Romans 14 takes the same thing up about food, special days, even the Sabbath. Some people keep the Sabbath and some don't. But he says to God, it's a matter of adiaphora. Observing the Sabbath, that is. The Sabbath is a gift from God to man. I would think no work is a gift that has to do with not so much obedience, but recognizing God's gifts to us. But how one observes that day, oh boy. But Paul says every man is before his own Lord, so don't you judge somebody else's servant. That person is a servant of God, so don't you go around judging somebody else's servant. And that's the same thing as being taken up in Romans 14. So that's one of the things that comes really out quite into the 20th century. His understanding of the Lord's table in verses 16 and 17 in chapter 10. It's pretty clear, it seems to me, well, both in chapter 10, 1 to 5, and in 15 and 16, it's clear that there are two points of view he has with regard to the Lord's table. One's in and one's out. The one that is out is a magical view. The idea that somehow by having participated in the sacraments, you are thereby secured is simply out for Paul. They had their form of the sacrament, but they're not saved. Now that leads me to suggest that, that the traditional Roman Catholic view of the sacraments is really not going to make it theologically. That is, because I've been baptized, I'm saved. Eternally, it doesn't matter, and as long as I get to the sacrament once a year. Now, that is, you know, thank the Lord, that kind of thing is breaking down all over the place in Roman Catholicism, but that is in fact a traditional view among Roman Catholics. The sacraments secure me, and it doesn't matter. After that, I'm Christian no matter what I do. Now, that's out for Paul. It's clear that that's out for Paul. It's just, that's the point of that passage. But, on the other hand, it's also clear from verses 15 and 16 that Paul had a much greater sense of real presence of some kind in the sacrament, in the Lord's table, than most Protestants do. You know, that becomes the very ground of his argument as to why you cannot participate at the demonic temple, because when you eat at the table of the Lord, you are really in some way participating in the Lord himself. There is some real participation going on. It's this passage that destroys Zwinglianism forever, making the traditional, what I call in the Anabaptist tradition, the whole Anabaptist tradition that sees the Lord's table purely as a memorial. And even that's an anathema word for me. You have memorials over dead people, and that's not what we're celebrating at the Lord's table. And just, it's purely memorial, nothing more. And therefore it doesn't have any meaning. And therefore what happens is you tack it at the end of a service once a month or once every 3 months, and you can take it or leave it. It was obviously not that way with the early church. They had the Lord's table almost, I'm convinced, every time they gathered together. They ate together in the presence of the Lord at their table, and their table had meaning to them. They really participated by faith, by God's grace, not magically, you understand. There wasn't any magic thing going on in those elements, but that there was a real sense of participation in God himself, which most Protestants tend not to have. So those kinds of things I hear. But those are not where the urgencies lie for us today. We're going to spend a few minutes with those other two things. First of all, 14 to 22, and the participation in the demonic. Now here is where I want to give you an illustration of how I think a passage like this can be taken out of the first century and translated into the 20th century. And even though we do not have exact particulars, we have some really comparable kinds of things. Comparable, but not exact. And that is participation in the demonic in any form. I think this is the place in the New Testament which one can really use to speak to young Christians who are, or older Christians, who are in some way playing around with, or dabbling in, or in some way exposing themselves to the demonic. This is the passage. Now, don't go running around everywhere else trying to build a theology. We've got a text in the New Testament that clearly, says no. Flee idolatry. And they say, well, I'm not an idolater. Yeah, but you understand idolatry means to participate in the demonic in any way, shape, or form. And here is where I'm ready to become very particular. It includes astrology. It includes the Ouija board, the tarot cards. It includes the whole business where people have exposed themselves or made it an opening into their lives with regard to the demonic. You cannot sit at the table of God and participate in the demonic at the same time. It is fair warning. And I have particularly strong feelings here about astrology, which so many American Christians are just playing with all the time. I think it's simply something that it's out. And it's out because it is not some law. It is out because it is contradictory to our existence as Christians. You understand what I mean? It stands in total contradiction to our existence as the eschatological people of God to be participating in the demonic. Now, you've had plenty of teaching in YWAM about those kinds of things, so I'm going to leave that. But this is the text for it, it's what I'm suggesting to you. And that's what I call a really valid translation, because we have the same particular now, the demonic. It's just that the demonic is located in a new place. There's a new locus for the demonic in our culture. And not altogether new. They had those kinds of things there too. But the point is that for us, the locus is pretty particularized into these occultish kind of things. So the occult is absolutely out for Christians. And whenever one does find himself in those moments when he is exposed in some way to the really demonic, you do have the promise of God of protection. And that's the promise of God in your life. God has destroyed the demonic powers in the cross. And they do not have power over the believer. I have a good friend who was a missionary, now teaches at the Western Kentucky University in the United States. He was a missionary in New Guinea. And he ended up in a home one night because of some emergency. He had ended up in a native hut, and it turned out that the man was a witch doctor, and he didn't know it. And he was lying by the fire with his feet to the fire and his head away, and his feet were freezing, absolutely freezing. And he didn't know what was going on, and suddenly he realized that he was being attacked by demonic power. And he began to pray in the name of Jesus, in the name of Jesus. And his feet warmed up. And the moment he ceased and tried to go back to sleep, he began to freeze to death again. And he began to just, in the name of Jesus, in the name of Jesus. Now Jesus is there protecting him. The demonic cannot destroy him because he belongs to Jesus Christ. And that's the promise of God's Word. But the point is, don't play with it. That's the point of the text. Now let's move on to the other thing, the stumbling block principle and adiaphora, because here is where we really are going to have some differences. You see, the real problem that we have when we come to adiaphora, the way that word is spelled, it equals culturally defined matters. The real problem is that some people think things are adiaphora that others don't. And the moment you start to talk about adiaphora, somebody's going to say, who says that's adiaphora? Of course God cares. And of course God cares because I care. Now Paul says God doesn't care. We were reflecting, a couple of us around here, and this just sort of came to me. This is one of those nice things that I love to be doing exegesis in community, because I'm always learning some things. And in the process of our reflecting around, sitting around here between the two sessions, it occurred to me, and it occurred to me because somebody else brought it up in the conversation, but some things occurred to me that really began to fall into place. What somebody remarked is this church, wow, you know, goodness, is it possible? Is it possible that this can really be a Christian church? These people doing all the things they're doing. And I want you to notice that Paul always treats them as brothers and sisters. You notice that? All the way through. Now, I would also like to suggest to you that you and I wouldn't treat them as brothers and sisters. We would have questioned their existence from the beginning. If we knew that they had gone to the temple and eaten in the presence of the idol, we would have questioned their existence altogether. We wouldn't, we wouldn't brother them anymore. We would treat them once again as somebody who needs to get saved. I mean, we would really wipe them out, write them off. They're simply not there. But notice how Paul says, "Such were some of you," in 6:9 to 11. I mean, that's a marvelous passage in 1 Corinthians, isn't it? "Such were some of you, but now you are washed," Now you are sanctified, brother, if this is what sanctified means. But this is Paul's point of view. They belong to God. But their problems are almost all ethical, you see. See, we start our judgments not at the theological level, but at the ethical level. If, in fact, somebody is not ethically squared away, we write them off. But we allow almost anything to go theologically. We allow legalism in the church. Legalism is okay. But, boy, don't get ethically aberrant in any way. Don't do anything that's different from my understanding of God's understanding of adiaphora. And yet, you'll notice when he writes Galatians, you'll notice that he doesn't brother them there. Oh, he says that, but what he says is, "You've fallen from grace. Who hath bewitched you?" He says, I am, in the place of a thanksgiving, which fall in all of his other letters, in Galatians he starts by saying, "I marvel that so soon you have been removed from the grace of him who called you." And all the Galatians were doing, and I mean this seriously, all the Galatians were doing was simply being circumcised. Nobody running to the temple, nobody having fornication, nobody being in incest, nobody being drunk at the Lord's table. All they were doing was simply being circumcised. And from Paul's point of view, they have opted out of the Christian faith. Now, isn't that a marvelous thing? It just goes to show you how far we've removed ourselves in the 20th century from the gospel of Jesus Christ of the first century. We have taken the gospel of Jesus Christ and made it into an ethical system only. And if anybody deviates from our understanding of the ethical system of the Christian faith, he's out. Paul's understanding has to do with what relationship do you have with God and how did you have that relationship. If that relationship is your trusting in God's grace, then you're in. And your ethics is going to have to square up with that, you understand. He doesn't allow. It's not optional. We've already said that plenty of times. The Spirit comes and it's not optional to be any old thing you wish. But nonetheless, what makes you what you are is the grace of God, the Spirit of God coming into your life. But if you revert to circumcision, where you're going to say, grace plus my works is what makes me right with God, then you've opted out of the Christian faith. Now, we allow the church to be filled with legalists, exactly of the circumcision type. Oh, but if you're not doing this, then you're not really Christian. And the Apostle Paul calls these people brothers and sisters. Now, he's correcting their conduct, you understand, because a proper theological is going to put proper horizontal. And the vertical is going to affect the horizontal. Remember the indicative and then the imperative. But it's going to be there. And it's going to be there because of the indicative. But now back to adiaphora, because we need to hear those kinds of things and before we get going. One of the great problems that we have, and this is from the 2nd century on, I can show you in the Christian church examples of literature in every last century from the 2nd century till now where Christians are divided on the basis of adiaphora. Tertullian, who was one of those great theologians who really had his mind put together in terms of the nature of God and Christology. He was what we also call a rigorist. If it was fun, Tertullian was against it. I'm in all seriousness. He has documents on the dress of women. He has a document on going to shows. He has a document on, I can't name all the things. I mean, women who wear mascara have opted out. And the reason they've opted out is because there is a intertestamental document called 1 Enoch which he thinks belongs in the Bible, in the Old Testament. And it says that one of the fallen angels taught women how to paint their faces with eye shadow. Now, not all Christians were Tertullian types, but there have always been the Tertullian types about. And going to shows, that is absolutely, absolutely forbidden. You know, I come from a tradition of this kind. And one of the neat things that happened to me was when I read Tertullian. The discovery of Tertullian as a graduate student was one of the most freeing experiences that I ever had. Because there I was able to laugh at myself and my tradition by reading it in the 2nd century and reading how ridiculous it sounded back then, and then putting it into the 20th century and saying how ridiculous this must sound to God in the 20th century. Now, my point is that God does not care one whit about your and my adiaphora. He doesn't even care. We do, but he doesn't. And the thing that really disturbs me about all of this is to go back to yesterday morning and the real ethics of the kingdom that we talked about yesterday. The thing that really disturbs me about this is that I live in a Christian context in which people don't care one snip whether they're ever going to be rid of their anger, whether they're ever going to quit gossiping, whether they're ever going to be kind, whether they're ever going to be helpful and good. They don't care about that at all, because that to them is adiaphora. But they would write you out of the kingdom if you drank wine with a meal. Because God really does care about that, even though the Bible doesn't say that he does care about that. In fact, he says the opposite in the Bible. Now, the thing that I am convinced that this is a trick of the enemy. I am convinced that the enemy has sown tares in the church right at this point. He has allowed us to make something important that God doesn't care about, and what God really cares about, he has allowed us to think is a matter of indifference. Now, that is a trick of the devil. God does care about anger. He does care about our loving our enemies. He does care about those things that have to do with the real relationships and attitudes and loving responses to humanity. But he doesn't care one whit whether you drink wine. Now, he doesn't. It is a matter of absolute adiaphora. In fact, in the Bible, wine happens to be one of those things that is always a mark of the blessing of God. You know, whenever they're going to talk about God's blessings, the abundance of wine. And my American friends say, he means grape juice. That's a cute trick. Especially since it takes refrigeration to have grape juice. You understand? Grape juice left to itself doesn't stay grape juice. And since grape juice was left to itself in antiquity, the only thing it was wine. Wine was wine. Jesus drank wine. In fact, since they accused him of being a wine bibber, I would guess that it probably didn't mean that he went around drinking water or goat's milk. What it probably meant was that he drank wine, and that there were those around like John the Baptist who abstained from wine and who were considered more religious, and since Jesus actually drank wine, he was considered a wine bibber and a glutton. He didn't have locusts and wild honey. I mean, what kind of a Messiah is this? At least the Messiah ought to have locusts and wild honey and no wine. That's why they were going after John the Baptist, but nobody was going after Jesus as Messiah, you understand. Nobody was thinking of him as Messiah. They made that confusion. I mean, they thought that about John the Baptist, interestingly enough, but they never thought that about Jesus, not once. Who do men say that I am? Not once do they say Messiah. Not a single instance do they ever think of him as Messiah. The reason they don't think of him as Messiah is that he doesn't fit their messianic categories. The Messiah at least has to be a rigorist. At least the Messiah isn't going to put that awful stuff to his lips. I mean, they drink it, but not the Messiah, you know. It's adiaphora. Pure, out-and-out adiaphora. God doesn't care. Now, I've sat in contexts like this and said things like this, and you know, it's like I might as well get tarred and feathered. I'm on my way out. Everything's been fine until now. And then I quit preaching and went to meddling. But my point is that this is what it's really at in the New Testament. All you have to do, I'm not arguing for Gordon Fee's position. I invite you to read the New Testament. Read 1 Corinthians 10, 23 to 31, or 33. Read Romans 14. And just translate into a different kind of adiaphora. I came from a context in my denomination. You know Darlene Cunningham, most of you, I would assume. Darlene and I grew up in the same church for several years when her father was pastor in church in Olympia, Washington. Every last afternoon in the summer, she and I and a whole group of us from the church were out to Miller Sylvania Lake. You know Miller Sylvania Lake, right? We were out swimming at Miller Sylvania Lake. Great sport. All kinds of fun. Her father resigned that church when I was a freshman in college and went to Akron, Ohio, in the same denomination. And in the same denomination, what we did at Miller Sylvania Lake in Akron, Ohio was called mixed bathing. I always laugh at that because they've already loaded the deck against me. Mixed bathing. At least perhaps mixed swimming, but mixed bathing. And you know, all my life I never realized that I was supposed to lust after the girls when I went swimming. Nobody ever told me that. So I went out and had fun swimming. But in Akron, Ohio, if you go swimming with girls, you lust after them, so you can't do that. Now, you understand that Brother Scratch didn't last long in Akron. Scratch, that's Darlene's father. That's her maiden name. He didn't last long in Akron because he really tried to make move the people to a biblical stance, but they weren't prepared to move to a biblical stance about that at all. You know, I mean, God had forbidden that. And on what basis? On the basis of the text that says, come out from among them and be ye separate, or on the basis of the text in 1 Thessalonians 5, avoid the very appearance of evil. Now, I want to just say a word about that text. A little exegesis will never hurt anybody. And the only reason anybody could have ever taken that text in the King James Bible and made that refer to something like mixed bathing, quote, or drinking wine, or going to dances, or playing cards that have faces on them, and all the rest of this adiaphora that we have made God's, diaphora. That the only way you could have ever come to that stance in that text is by reading a King James Bible where every verse becomes a paragraph and you destroy the flow of Paul's thought. Now, what happens in that passage is that Paul says that that church is a charismatic church. And there's some people in there that are having some trouble with the charismatic expressions. And he says, don't quench the spirit, don't despise prophesyings, but test all things and hold fast to what is good and get rid of what's evil. And where he says get rid of what's evil is translated into the King James, avoid the very appearance of evil, because they didn't see that it was a last thing that was said about testing the spirits as to whether it's good or not. It has absolutely nothing to do even with adiaphora. It has to do with the spirit in the church. And that becomes the text whereby, well, now all you have to do is move from culture to culture. In the same denomination, in the United States, in my denomination, wine is out. But in the same denomination in Italy, the same preachers in the same denomination drink wine. In fact, we poor Americans, when we come to Europe, almost can't exist because we drink water all the time. Water with every meal. And you come into a European situation, you just, water, just give me some water. And then they give you mineral Wasser. Yeah. That's a purely an Americanization, but that's where I am. But adiaphora. God doesn't care. Now, I'm going to give you an illustration that's also going to help to illustrate this whole business of offending and stumbling block and the whole rest of it. And it's a personal illustration. And sometimes it still hurts. My children were raised in our home in a situation where we had really come to recognize the difference between what God, what God thinks counts and what the church thinks counts. And we tried to always make sure that the children, as they were growing up, recognized that when the church did think that it counted, that we had to live within the context of our church. That's the loving thing to do. That is, let me go back to a minute. Drinking wine is purely adiaphora. It matters not at all. God doesn't care. But in context, it can become a matter. See? Because the stumbling block principle and offense comes in. If you're in the context of people who are offended by that, then you don't. And it's not because you change your position, it's simply because you're free. You're free to or not to. Now, children can't usually handle that. And so what happens is you ordinarily go toward the least common denominator, namely abstinence, for the most part. We are in our home. My wife and I, for example, are quite free. In fact, we enjoy a meal out because it gives us an opportunity to have wine with our meal. But we never do that in our home. And the reason we don't do that in our home is precisely because there's that concern that we have with regard to the children and our relationship to the church, where that is a real problem. That kind of thing where we want them to love within the context of the church. Because that's where they found their life, and that's where we have our life, and we love the church. But we also are free to talk about these kind of things. In other words, it's free. They know, we know, that God doesn't care. When my son was an 8th grader, and he had just had a marvelous experience, about a year before this, in a youth convention, both he and his sister had really had their lives just remarkably turned around, just as young teenagers, 12, 13. And he was gung-ho for Jesus. I mean, he just wasn't passive. He was gung-ho for Jesus. And this gung-ho Jesus kid came home one day and announced to his parents that he was going to the school dance. Now, it just so happened that in our tradition, dancing was really bad. I mean, the dance was so bad that in our Sunday school literature, the Sunday school literature always promised that if you didn't get to go to the dance, you'd get to go to the banquet. Until my wife and I got ill over the Sunday school literature, Somebody finally maintained their Christian stance by refusing to take a date to the dance. But some bright knight in shining Christian armor came and invited her to the banquet. Blah! Blah! There are some moments in the church when I get a little bit more upset than others, and that's one of them. Our literature is still spewing out that stuff. Sheer garbage. But I was raised in a context where dancing was out. I was student body president in my high school, and I didn't attend the senior prom. I sat on the outside looking in. Everybody else in my class went, but Gordon Fee, because that was out. That was sin. My wife is in the same kind of thing. Her context is even more legalistic than mine. She played high school tennis, and her mother wouldn't let her wear slacks or shorts or cutoffs of any kind. Nothing that looked like men's, because there's a text in Deuteronomy that says don't wear men's clothing. And so she played tennis in a skirt. I just... I mean, the absurdity of that every once in a while catches me. She couldn't play in slacks, but she could play in a skirt, which every time her leg came up, you know, exposed. But that was all right. Because at least she was obedient to Scripture. Oh, boy, I tell you. There are moments when it's no wonder that in my generation growing up, that 90% of the people in my generation, my church, don't serve the Lord today. This is no wonder at all. I can understand it. And the thing that saved me was my dad. My dad is a great Christian, and somehow he could laugh at some of this and get over it and still live within the context. Now, I love my context, you understand. I'm just saying that it's the adiaphora. This is the place where I've always had my difficulties. But I had come to the realization that in my head, you know, God doesn't care about the dance. I knew that in my head. But that had never got down to here. Never had got down to there. Mostly because I had never had an occasion for it to do so. And my son came home and said he was going to the dance. And boy, it hit me right here. Right square in my gut. I just tied up knots. Here's my head saying, God doesn't care. And here's my whole being just literally torn up by this thing. My wife is even having more difficulties with it. So she's praying. We talked with him, told him why we had some concerns, especially about the church and all that. And he listened to us, paid attention to us, went and prayed about it, said, I don't think God cares whether I go to the dance or not, so I'm going to go to the dance. So my wife is praying. And she's sort of praying like this. Make it miserable, Lord. Make it miserable. The Sunday school literature had got to her. She was saying, oh, Lord, make it so that in his first experience, something bad will happen, you know, so that he'll never want to go again kind of thing. I mean, she wasn't really articulating it quite that way, but that's what's going on in her mind as she's praying. And he comes home, and we expect to see, you know, bomb out Dolesville. And he comes home on cloud 9. It's the greatest thing he's ever done. He says, all those people were standing around. They didn't know anything about dancing. He said, they weren't doing anything. He says, so I took another friend, and not a gal, a friend. He says, we went out in the middle floor, we showed him how to dance. Well, he didn't know how to dance either, but he's a hyperactive kid. He's like his dad in that way. And he just got out there and started doing it. And pretty soon the whole place was doing it. And they were just having it was a great evening. And I says to myself, God can't be in this. Boy, I tell you, it took a while for my stomach to finally get in touch with my... That happened the first time I ever went to a movie theater, too, by the way. You know, movies were out. Watch them on TV, but boy... Pretty soon I had to land on some that you think are pretty serious because you're laughing at me. Anyway, I want to tell you a further bit about that story. 2 years ago, when my daughter was a sophomore, junior, I can't remember which year now. I think it was in her sophomore year in high school. She went to a school dance. It was a time when her brother wasn't there, and for some reason he was out somewhere else. She had gone alone. And they go pretty regularly. It's no big deal with them. They really are free. They can take it or leave it. And that's the only thing I'm really concerned about. They really are free. If the dance comes, I don't have any great difficulties. If there's something else that we should be doing as a family, and I say, hey, look, we're going to be doing this tonight, so you've got to make some other, you know. I don't have any hassle about that. Oh, we do once in a while because they've made some other plans, but it's not the dance per se, okay? They're really free, and I thank God for that. But she came home about an hour after she'd gone to the dance. And the reason she came home is it turned out to be a bad scene. There was a lot of drinking. Some kids had come in with drugs. The band was very much into acid rock kind of stuff. And she said, I don't belong here. And she came home. That was the day that I felt we had won something in our home. We had done the thing in her life that was the only possible Christian thing. We hadn't laid a law upon her that said the dance is out. But somehow in the midst of all of this, she sensed that there are things that there are things that are contradictory to her existence as a Christian. Just contradictory to her existence as a Christian. And that, it seems to me, is what Paul is after in these passages. To move to that kind of situation, that kind of realization about adiaphora, where God doesn't care. And in my own life, I'm free. Free to or not to, but precisely because I'm free, I am free not to. And that leads me to say then a final word about this from my point of view, and the Pauline point of view. And that is that there are times when you may feel perfectly free to do something. But you must give that freedom. That freedom must be exercised in giving something up for the sake of someone else. And if you can't do that, then you are not free. And you are not really, in that moment, a disciple of our Lord Jesus Christ. It's precisely because these things don't count that they really don't count. And therefore, it doesn't matter. Now, I'm concerned not only about causing people to stumble, but offending. I live in a context, back in the United States, generally what I call the general overall evangelical context. Even though I'm a member of one denomination, I have spent most of my life in the evangelical world at large. And I know that there are some things that I must not do when I'm in the context of some of these people that I am perfectly free to do. And it's not that I want to go and say, hey, you know what I'm free to do? That's just nothing but sheer out and out pride. That's knowledge puffing up. It's love that builds up. And when your adiaphora becomes more important than a brother or sister in Christ, then it's not adiaphora anymore, and it's sinful. And I want to say a final word. I taught at Wheaton College, where students come from this kind of context, this very legalistic context. They come to Wheaton and they took a class from me in 1 Corinthians, and then they went running across campus saying, Dr. Fee said it was all right to drink, when in fact it was forbidden them to drink while they attended the college. Now, I never said it was all right to drink. I said God didn't care. But in the context of Wheaton College, I always reminded them it was a different matter, because here there are some rules that have to do with the college, and you've come voluntarily under the rules of the college, and therefore it is a matter of obedience and morality that has to do with your faithfulness, your trust in your word. But many times, in these kinds of contexts, students really begin to get free. And I saw it happening. I can remember in some kids' lives, just the journey through Galatians, just the teaching of Galatians. I saw some people freed up in their Christian lives until they went from what I call down in the mouth, straight-laced, good-for-nothing Christians to beautiful, dynamic, freedom-loving Christians. Grace had freed them up to really love. But I also saw some people who became kind of free in their minds, and in the process they learned to love, but they only learned to love in one direction. They learned to love in the direction that they were going, but they could never return love in the direction from which they had come. When they went back home to the home church, they went back and tore things up. Now I weep over that. If you can't love to your right as well as to your left, then you better come back to the cross. When I laugh at my denomination, I want you to know that I love these people in the Lord Jesus Christ. And that when I'm with the Jews, I am as a Jew. It's no difference to me. That matters not to me. Now I'm considered, a really bad number by a lot of people because I'm free to be when I'm among the Gentiles, I'm as the Gentiles in these things. But I really love them. I really love them. And hopefully, by God's grace, we can love them out of their legalism in some places too. And I think that's a necessary thing to do, to really lay the Word. But not lay it on them heavy, but to really sit and hope that God... And the greatest thing that I can find is a church where all members can really become to recognize that these things are adiaphora. Some do and some don't, but they both love one another. And when you've come to that, you've come to the real thing. And those who do, don't look down their noses at those who don't. And those who don't judge those who do. They just recognize that I can't and they can, but we really love one another and really do. And I know churches like that, and that is where the New Testament is taking its... Well, now, I've spent an awful lot of time on getting this into the 20th century, but I think probably those are the kinds of things you had in the back of your mind anyway, and if I didn't touch on your specific, you do your own translating, okay? Now, we're going to spend 15 minutes, the final 15 minutes on this tape, beginning chapter 11, verses 2 to 16. From here on out, everything else we do in 1 Corinthians is going to deal with the community at worship. And what you need to keep in view is that we are dealing with the community at worship in the assembly. Everything has to do with that. Now, I'm going to re-emphasize that tomorrow morning when we come to chapters 12 to 14. Because there is so much stuff that has been written on chapter 12 that is simply not in context. Some stuff that I don't mean to always be sounding as if I'm the final word. I'm not the final word, and I know that, and you'd better come to know that. But frankly, there's some stuff that's been written on 1 Corinthians 12 that is simply bad news. And it's bad news because it has simply lost the sense that this is written to the church in worship. This isn't running around trying to find out what your gift is, which is one of the contemporary things. Is simply, you're going to have a hard time convincing me you can get that out of the New Testament, given that that thing was written to the church in terms of gifts in context of the assembly and worship. Not the individualization of gifts that is the concern of Paul at all in that passage. In fact, the concern is the diversity of gifts for the sake of the community at worship. It's the community at worship that's involved. That's going on here from 11 through 14. Everything is the community in worship. Now, the problem that we face is how many of these things reflect their letter. 12:1 certainly does. Now concerning spiritual gifts. Our only problem there is that we don't know what they could have possibly asked. 11:17 suggests quite the opposite. It says, in the first place, when you assemble as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I partly believe it. Verse 18, he says. And he hears that. So here we have apparently another matter of report. Well, that makes 11:2 kind of up for grabs. Did they ask him about this matter? Or did he hear about this matter? And we really can't answer that. I'm not going to even say, I think it's a part of their letter, but that's the kind of thing that we simply finally can't answer. Now, the passage is filled with enormous difficulties. First of all, there are some existential tensions that we have when we come to the text that have to do with male-female relationships. Although it seems to me that's not the point of the passage at all. It's one of those places where the thing that isn't the point, we've made the point, and the thing that is the point, we've left alone. Now, we're going to have to talk about male-female relationships because that, in fact, does become the theological base of the argument for what's going on. And we need to say something about what Paul says there. But there are also the difficulties because there are several expressions that are not clear. The word head, for example, is used in two ways. Sometimes it means the head, literal head. And other times it becomes metaphorical. And when it becomes metaphorical, we don't know what it means. What does it mean for a man to be the head of the wife? Well, it surely doesn't mean he's the Lord over the wife. That would be certainly a foreign idea because he talks about the Father being the head of Christ in the same way. And one can hardly think of the Father and the Son in some kinds of relationship where one member of the deity is Lord over the other in the deity. That's just not going to make it. So what does head mean when it's used metaphorically? Well, that's difficult. I'm not going to suggest I have easy answers to that. The very phrase that appears doesn't ever, and that's nothing in the text ever says anything about a veil. That isn't mentioned once in the text. The phrases that appear are in Greek kata kephalos echon, which means having down from the head. That's a literal rendition of the Greek text, having down from the head. And then there's another text that says uncovered with respect to the head. Now you put those together and it sounds as if there is a head covering and it's not hair, because he argues from hair back to the propriety of therefore worshiping with something besides hair, namely some covering hanging down from the head. But we have no idea as to what that really is. My guess is it means a veil over the face. This is not covering the hair, but it's covering the face that is almost certainly what is really going to make sense of the passage. But again, I can't be sure of that. And then finally, the really crucial text, namely verse 10, has two almost totally baffling expressions. Your translation, the RSV, at least that's the one I'm reading, says that is why a woman ought to have a veil on her head. Well, it just so happens that the text doesn't say veil at all. The text says that is why a woman ought to have authority on her head because of the angels. Now, what authority on her head and what because of the angels means, I defy you. We'll work on that too, but okay. Now, finally, we simply do not know. And if anybody has told you that they do know, you can just mark my word for it. At one point where Dr. Fee is dogmatic, and that is, not one point, I'm dogmatic all the time, do you understand? I mean dogmatic in this instance. Nobody knows what the prevailing custom was. Now we've got a lot of guesses, and if sometimes our guesses sound like we really know that's what's going on, that's our fault, because nobody knows what the prevailing custom was, and that, of course, is what is being abused and is being corrected. They knew, and Paul knew. We don't know. We don't know what the prevailing custom was in terms of culture and the social background, nor do we know what was really happening in the church in Corinth. Now, despite all those difficulties, this particular text has become the basis for a habit that still persists in the church in the 20th century, both in the Roman Catholic Church and among Plymouth Brethren, which lie in the absolute opposite ends of the spectrum with regard to ecclesiology. The most totally Congregationalist kind of situation, the Plymouth Brethren, and the most totally Episcopalian kind of situation in the Roman Catholics. They both require women to have something over their heads, even if it's a little tiny strip of band, covering nothing but there, symbolically. They require that. Not always anymore in the United States, but generally speaking, that's still true. Although in both cases, neither what is done nor the reason for it belongs to the Apostle Paul. That is, they do it on the basis of this text, but they're certainly not doing it, and they're not obeying what Paul tells them to do, namely keep their faces covered. And they're certainly not doing it on the grounds that Paul suggests. Now, in the few moments that we have remaining in this tape, we're going to present the problem. And then in our next hour this evening, we're going to try to wrestle with what Paul's answer is and what it's going to mean to us in the 20th century. Here is one of those that I really feel like I'm walking on eggs. Because here, whatever I say, it's not going to make everybody happy. It doesn't make me happy either, because I wish I knew. But I don't always know in this instance. And so we're going to have to be loving and patient with one another, but at least let's say something about the problem. And what I want to say about the problem is to repeat. We don't know. We simply do not know. Here are some suggestions. Number one, it has been suggested, and I think with real cogency, that Paul is hereby introducing into a pagan context a Jewish custom. That is, what is going on in this text is not something they were already doing, but Paul is now introducing it into the church, the practice in the church in Corinth. And what they argue is that Paul believed that there was freedom in certain areas, namely adiaphora, but in worship it was a different matter. Because in worship it was important to maintain the distinctions between the sexes. That's a possibility. A second possibility is that it's related to pagan worship. That is, it's possible, and there does seem to be at least a single shred of evidence about this from antiquity, that in the mystery cults, women were forbidden to be veiled. That is, that was the one thing that was absolutely forbidden of women in the mystery cults when they were in their inner initiatory kinds of rites. They were forbidden to be veiled. And therefore, Christian women were doing the same thing, and it smacked of paganism. By being unveiled in the presence of God, it looked as if they were, carrying over the practices of the mystery cults. And Paul is certain. I can lean toward that. That makes a lot of sense to me that that's possibly what's going on. The third possibility, which is the one I tend to lean toward, but I finally have to just admit that I don't know, is that what we have going on in the church in Corinth is that there was a custom that was a prevailing custom in the churches all over the place, and that the Corinthian women are asserting their freedom on the basis of either enthusiasm or over-realized eschatology. They are asserting their newfound freedom. And they are thereby discarding a custom which is upsetting the worship of the community. Now, one of those three, it seems to me, certainly makes sense in terms of what's possibly behind all of this. Before we conclude, let me just say a couple of things about what we do know. And here are some things that we can say, yes, this really we do know. Number one, what we do know from this text is that the Corinthian women participated in worship. If they didn't participate in the worship, then the whole text is of no sense at all. It is their participation in worship unveiled that is the problem. It isn't being there unveiled. It is praying and prophesying with their faces uncovered. So participating in worship is surely what they did. Whatever we're going to do with chapter 14, verses 34 to 36, they participated in the worship. Now, secondly, we can be sure that some of them were doing so uncovered as to their heads. Whatever that custom was, they were doing it disregarding that custom. That's another thing we can be certain of. The third thing that we can be certain of is that by worshiping uncovered with regard to their face or head, they were breaking a prevailing custom that was going on. They were breaking a custom. And fourth, we can be sure that Paul feels strongly enough about it to speak to it. He says, in fact, when praying and prophesying, a woman ought to have her head uncovered. Now that's the answer. A woman ought to have her head covered. I'm sorry. I said it backwards. I didn't mean to say it that way. A woman ought to have her head covered when praying and prophesying, and she ought to do so, and then he musters a number of reasons, theological and otherwise, to try to pin that thing down. But the answer is, have your head or face covered when praying and prophesying. That's the only real answer given in the text. It's the reasons for coming to that give us all the difficulty that we're going to have to look at. So we're going to look at that answer in great detail when we start in the next lecture. Okay.